Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. I hope the week is off to a good start for all of you. My name is Carrie McLean, and I am the chair of the NLG's Africa Subcommittee. Welcome to the webinar, AFRICOM and US Militarism in Africa. I'm so pleased that Professor Horace G. Campbell is here to share his knowledge on this topic. Professor Campbell has been writing about and speaking about AFRICOM for over a decade. Professor Campbell is an internationally known peace and justice activist. He holds a joint professorship in the Department of African American Studies and the Department of Political Science at Syracuse University. He's taught in Asia, Europe, and Africa. For example, he taught at the University of Dar Salaam from 1981 to 1987, and more recently was a Distinguished Kwame Nkrumah Chair at the Institute of African Studies at the University of Ghana. Professor Campbell's most recent book is Global NATO and the Catastrophic Failure in Libya, Lessons for Africa in the Forging of African Unity. His most well-known book, Rasta and Resistance from Marcus Garvey to Walter Rodney, is going through its 8th printing and has been translated into 4 languages. He's also the author of Reclaiming Zimbabwe, The Exhaustion of the Patriarchal Model of Liberation. Professor Campbell is completing a book on US militarism and African independence. He's authored over 100 journal articles and a dozen monographs, including a recent publication entitled The Quagmire of US Militarism in Africa. Without further ado, I present Professor Horace Campbell.
Okay, good afternoon, Kerry, and thank you for inviting me to participate in this webinar. I can see that there are many friends and colleagues and comrades who have joined this webinar. And I want to say that the National Lawyers Guild is an organization that I have some familiarity with because my comrade, Joan Gibbs, who has been working in the vineyards for many decades, as someone who has worked tirelessly for human rights, against mass incarceration, against the prison industrial complex, and working for Palestinian solidarity. And Joan Gibbs, I think, was the one who was the force behind bringing us together for that last conference that we held. Today, that conference was held when there was still anxiety in the country about the outcome of the uprisings in 2020 and the future of white supremacy. Some of that has now been abated at the end of the electoral process. And so when I was asked by the National Lawyers Guild to participate in this discussion, I thought it'd be an opportunity to raise some questions about the future of the United States military in general, and in particular on the US military command. So I would like you to bear with me to place the question of the United States Africa Command in the larger context of the United States militarism and the military management of the international system. The basic thesis of this presentation is that the anti-racist forces internationally must be in the forefront of pushing for the demilitarization of the planet Earth and ending the military management of the international system. And I will probably explain how the military management of the international system forces the militarization of US foreign policy. So specifically, the African descendants in the United States and those who suffer from racial capitalism must focus on demilitarization. And in this sense, the demilitarization involves the dismantling of the US Africa Command. Throughout the year 2020, the pandemic, the pandemic of racism, systemic racism, the pandemic of capitalism, police violence. These questions brought massive mobilization of people to oppose the militarization of the US society. And the challenge for the peace movement, having mobilized politically in the streets and electorally to defeat the Trump administration, is to say whether the coming into government on January 20th, 2021, will this bring about significant changes in the military management of the international system? And will this bring about changes in the US-Africa Command? Now, these questions have been sharpened by the fact that a week after the election results, the Pentagon announced that there was the consolidation of the US Army Europe and the US Army Africa. This consolidation of the US Army Europe and the US Army Africa was one outcome of the activism of people in Africa who have been calling for the dismantling of the US Africa Command. In fact, throughout its 12-year history from 2008 to the present, the US Africa Command was never able to gain legitimacy in Africa. And the opposition from the entire African continent, especially the youth and progressive forces, that reflected itself in some governments calling for the AFRICOM not to be placed anywhere on the continent. This meant that the US Africa Command was always on the defensive when it came to Africa. So this announcement of consolidating the US Army Europe and the US Army Africa is going against the very thing that Donald Rumsfeld said when they launched AFRICOM in 2006, 2007, that they wanted to end the African domination through the United States European Command. And I will spend a little bit of time talking about the US military management and the command structure, the European Command, the Pacific Command, the Central Command. Africa was under the Central Command at that time, and Rumsfeld established the Africa Command. What we will do, though, in this presentation is to demonstrate how the Africa Command was part of the information operations of the United States military. And by information operations, I mean the vast propaganda machine that was established by the government that integrated the military, the financial institutions, the political institutions, the think tanks and academia to hype the idea of war. And then in the case of the war on terror, Africa and Africans were labeled terrorists. But this psychological warfare really was one component of the reproduction of white supremacy and systemic racism. And so this psychological warfare never had any great roots in Africa. So this consolidation of the US Army Europe and US Army Africa will bring us to highlight the changing justifications for the US Africa Command. At all times, they were talking about fighting terrorism, stopping China from encroaching in Africa, And then another time they were talking about development, diplomacy, and democracy and defense. So the point is, the military planners never had a coherent justification for launching a US Africa Command, other than to militarize Africa and to draw African dictators and African militarists closer into the web of US militarism globally. So what we have seen in the past 12 years is that the history of US racism and militarism has led to the destruction of African lives. We've seen that in the past, but what the Pentagon calls the watershed moment for the US Africa Command was the destruction of the Libyan society. And now when the US military writes about AFRICOM, they no longer write about Libya as part of their success. Although 9 years ago in October, when they killed Gaddafi, they were calling that the US was most successful operation was in Libya. The current role of the United States military in Niger, supporting French militarism and the European control of West Africa, is the current manifestation of AFRICOM. So the constellation of the US Army in Africa and the US Army Europe is to return the US military and the US government to the alliance with white racists in Western Europe. So this is going against what the Africans have been calling for silencing guns in 2020 and the role of the African Union. In the conclusion, we will link the question of demilitarization in Africa to the question of reparative justice. How do we repair the crimes of white supremacy? How do we repair the planet Earth? How do we repair the history of white supremacy and systemic racism? How do we repair the destruction of capitalism? These questions are very much urgent, and I am optimistic that the National Lawyers Guild and the progressive forces who have been in the forefront of opposing AFRICOM will intensify their work in drawing new constituencies into the intellectual information and academic work, which must be unleashed to mobilize the society against the US Africa Command. So this is what I'm hoping to do in the next 20 or so minutes. So let me start by focusing on this new announcement, because this new announcement is actually a victory in some sense, because the US Africa Command is winding up its old operation in Stuttgart, Germany, because when the US Africa Command was announced, they were looking for a base in Africa, but they could not find a base in Africa because of the opposition of African leaders, especially the South African leadership at that time, Terry Lakota and Thabo Mbeki. And so the US Africa Command based itself in Stuttgart, Germany. Though last week it was announced that the US Africa Command will merge the Europe and Africa Commands under a single 4-star headquarters, and it's going to be based in Italy or southern Spain. So why did the Pentagon make this move? And what is the importance of this move for the future of the US Africa Command? I think this is where we want to begin, because we want to begin with the expanded militarization of the society since the deepening of the capitalist crisis at the turn of the 21st century. At the turn of the 21st century, the deepening capitalist crisis, which we saw in 2007, 2008, and we saw that in the financial crisis at the end of the 20th century, the United States embarked on a major militarization of the planet. And the architects of this militarization came from the most conservative and racist section of the United States population. The military operations were unleashed under what Donald Rumsfeld called the information operations. That is the use of information, propaganda, and psychological warfare against the United States population. Now, the writings by journalists from the New York Times then talked about how this psychological warfare and propaganda was aimed against the citizens of the United States of America. And one of the quotations from David Barstow of the New York Times was that the people should not be prepared just for a long war against Afghanistan and Iraq, but for a long war, that is, for the United States to be involved in unending wars. And recently, there's a scholar from the Brookings Institute who has written about this propaganda, and he labeled the propaganda misinformation from Donald Trump, and how Donald Trump is actually basing his entire leadership on lies. But to locate the disinformation, propaganda, and lies at the feet of the Republican Party under Donald Trump is to miss the continuities in the militarization of the planet Earth by the US government that goes from the United States went off the dollar in 1971. And this militarization has been bipartisan. And in the past 12 to 14 years, the United States has spent over $6 trillion on these unending wars. So Anthony Postman from the Center for Strategic and International Studies has come out with studies that these expenditure of trillions of dollars have only created more insecurity in the world. And so these studies of the US military on the US Army in Iraq, Volume 1, Invasion, Insurgency, and Civil War, and Volume 2, Surge and Withdrawal. This study by the military itself talked about the failures of the United States military in Iraq. What is needed from the activists, from those who are allied to the National Lawyers Guild and progressive academics, peace activists, and I see my comrade from the Black Alliance for Peace is also in this webinar. And they've been doing a lot of work on this question of AFRICOM and dismantling AFRICOM. What is needed is that the same kind of investment in exposing the wars in Afghanistan and the trillions of dollars, the same kind of investment is needed so that we can see how the evolution of the United States Africa Command has brought about the same kind of destruction in Africa. So the writings on the United States Africa Command can be divided into more or less 3 or 4 different groups. And I would, my writings, along with progressive scholars from the African Studies group, they call the Concerned African Studies Scholars, and groups like the Black Alliance for Peace. That is one body of work that has been done on the US AFRICOM and the US Africa Command. But most journalists, most churches, humanitarian organizations do not have access to that body of scholarship. The dominant reproduction of ideas on the US Africa Command comes out of the itself, because one of the things that the US Africa Command did in its development was to set up what they call the United States Africa Command Social Science Council, so that most of the research done on Africa by universities had to be routed through the Pentagon. So any kind of search through libraries or through the internet would bring you back to the ideas that come from the Pentagon about Africa being a hotbed of terrorism and Africa being a base for instability. And in fact, some of the people who call themselves progressive go back to the same disinformation and psychological warfare of the Pentagon to reproduce ideas about Africa being a hotbed. One of the things which even some of my colleagues in the peace movement do is to reproduce these maps, which show that the US Africa Command have bases all over Africa. And I say to myself, do they understand how much they're reproducing the propaganda of the US military? Because when a writer writes about that the United States have military bases all over Africa, they never had more than 6,000 or 7,000 troops in Africa. So what those people on the left are actually trying to tell us is that 7,000 to 8,000 United States military personnel on the African continent can control 1 billion persons. And I want to appeal to my brothers and sisters in the peace movement and on the left not to reproduce that kind of literature and these maps that shows the United States Africa Command controlling Africa in the same way. And so we have a body of scholarship, and a lot of this writing come from those around the Intercept. And the Intercept, they depend on what they write from the communications department of the US Africa Command. So that's the second body of scholarship. I'm sorry, that's the third body of scholarship. And the fourth body of scholarship on the US Africa Command is from the think tanks, like the Brookings Institute, the American Enterprise Institute, the CSIS, Federation of American Scientists. So what I'm trying to say is that the literature and information that comes on the AFRICOM is dominated by the Pentagon and mainstream forces. And so this work to try to unleash a new understanding of AFRICOM is very important to break the sense that Africa is a hotbed of terror and terrorism. We may want to say from the outset that this psychological warfare and disinformation about Africa being the hotbed of terror and terrorism could never hold sway among Africans, because the racism of the United States system was such that all African freedom fighters were labeled as terrorists. Whether it's Felix Mume in the Cameroon, Samora Machel in Mozambique, Patrice Lumumba in the Congo, Nelson Mandela in South Africa, all African freedom fighters were labeled as terrorists. And therefore, the United States information and reproducing ideas about terrorism could never find root among African descendants, either in Africa or in the United States of America. I would like to remind those who are younger on this webinar that it was a leader such as Malcolm X who said very clearly in the early 1960, when there was a struggle over the Congo, that if you do not understand what's going on in the Congo, you cannot know what's going on in Mississippi. And Malcolm X, Maya Angelou, Amir Baraka stormed the United Nations at the time of the killing of Patrice Lumumba. And one of the outstanding questions for the United States military apparatus, academic apparatus, is the complicity of the United States government in the killing of Patrice Lumumba and the killing of the Secretary General of the United Nations, Dag Hammarskjöld. In fact, while Africans have forced the United Nations to unleash an investigation into the killing of Dag Hammarskjöld, the United States has still not complied with opening up their history of the complicity of the United States in the killing of Dag Hammarskjöld. So although the United States has embarked on this information operation and they've invested millions of dollars on studies on how to bring peace and humanitarianism to Africa, it could never get anywhere in Africa. However, after the defeat of the white supremacists in South Africa, the military defeat of the South Africans at Kutupana Valley was a turning point in the history of Africa. And then, even then, Chester Crocker and the United States wrote on the changes in Southern Africa that it was the United States that was bringing peace to Southern Africa. At the end of apartheid, the United States embarked on what they call the Africa Crisis Response Initiative. The Africa Crisis Response Initiative was the announcement of the Clinton administration that they were going to be more active militarily in Africa, and the legitimation at that point was to support humanitarianism. Now, I should add that in 1993, when the United States military was humiliated in Somalia, PDD 25 of the Clinton administration did not want the United States military to be engaged in Africa. But the competition between the Europeans and the United States over Africa led to the establishment of the Africa Crisis Response Initiative and the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act. The Africa Growth and Opportunity Act were the twin, was like a pincer movement to intensify the United States military operations in Africa. This did not get anywhere. And afterwards they changed to the quota. But what is important is that under George Bush, the definition of AFRICOM as the lead agency to fighting the war on terror in Africa was one where the United States represented itself as supporting Africans in fighting HIV/AIDS. So George Bush got Congress to spend or to put $15 billion towards PEPFAR, Presidential Initiative to Fight AIDS. But one of the things that the research will bring out is that this money, most of this money did not go into Africa. So the United States said at that time that they were going to fight terrorism. And the challenge of the peace activists and the opposition from Africans meant that the United States had to be continuously reformulating its position. So AFRICOM was established in 2008. Between 2006 and 2008, the United States moved to integrate the responsibilities of three command structures. The European command structure, which covered the United States military presence in Europe. Central Command, which represented the United States military presence in the West Asia, so that the wars that have been fought since 2001 have been fought through Central Command, which is based in Tampa, and the Pacific Command. So the Africa as an area of responsibility had been divided between the three commands: the European Command, the Central Command, and the Pacific Command. The Pacific Command had the islands of Malagasy and the islands in the Indian Ocean. The European Command had control over most of Africa, and the Central Command had East Africa along with Egypt. One of the important changes about the Africa Command is that the Africa Command not included Egypt because of the importance of Egypt in relation to the oppression of the Palestinian people and the alliance of the Egyptian leadership with Israel. So Egypt, up to this point, was never under the US Africa Command. And one of the things I would like to appeal for all those on this webinar is that progressive Africans should never use the formulation sub-Saharan Africa. The formulation sub-Saharan Africa is in itself a racist formulation which comes out of the old formulations like tropical Africa, Black Africa, and the African Union is a union of the peoples of Africa, of all parts of Africa. So it really hurts me when I hear my brothers and sisters who are in the progressive movement talks about sub-Saharan Africa. There's no, the sub-Saharan Africa, that formulation is also part of the racism that separates African people north of the Sahara and separate them from African people south of the Sahara. So the creation of the US Africa Command continues this confusion among the US military planners and the State Department. So for the Pentagon, they deal with AFRICOM, which is all 54 countries of Africa except Egypt. For the State Department, they have sub-Saharan Africa, and then they have North Africa and the Middle East. And then the different departments of the US government and the US university system that reproduce this racism about sub-Saharan Africa cannot decide whether Sudan is part of sub-Saharan Africa or Sudan is part of the rest of Africa. So at all times, the US Africa Command was premised on the idea of bringing peace to Africa. George Bush in February 2007, when they were discussing in the national security corridors of the United States, says that the new command will strengthen our security cooperation with Africa and create new opportunities to bolster the capabilities of our partners in Africa. Africa Command will enhance our efforts to bring peace and security to the people of Africa and promote our common goals of development, health, education, democracy, and economic growth in Africa. So this is the justification for Africa Command. Note the word partners in Africa. And what they mean by partners in Africa are those African governments that ally with the United States government that implement neoliberal policies in Africa to exploit the African peoples. And their leading partner in Africa is Sisi of Egypt, and Museveni of Uganda, Deby of Chad, the Ethiopian leadership, Kagame. These are the leaders that they talk about when they talk about the United States partners in Africa. So the justification then in 2007 for the Africa Command was to build partnership capacity, support the United States government agencies in implementing security policies. And when they mean security in Africa, they mean security of capital. Conduct theater security cooperation, increase partner counterterrorism skills, enhance humanitarian assistance, and foster respect for human rights and support Africa regional organizations. And the Africa regional organizations they do not support is the African Union, because they undermine the African Union and efforts of the African Union to bring peace. So at that point, in 2008, the Department of Defense, their reasons for going into Africa is to prevent disruptions in African oil production and export. I'm drawing this to your attention because by 2015, when the United States becomes the number one oil producer in the world, the question of African oil was no longer important in the legitimation of Africa Command. But this question of China and Chinese economic transformation has always been important to the United States. So the Department of Defense in 2007 said they want to meet the challenge of China in Africa. This has now come back to be one of the main justifications for AFRICOM. Controlling ungoverned regions and transnational extremism, dealing with instability in the Horn of Africa, dealing with instability in the Great Lakes region, and dealing with instability in Sudan. So the US Africa Command established their legitimacy, and they had the areas of responsibility. I want to point out that before the US Africa Command, we had the United States European Command, which covers all of Europe. And then the US European Command covered all of Africa. And then we have the United States Central Command. The announcement last week brings back the United States back to the period of the United States European Command, where the United States will be aligning itself with European colonialists in Africa, especially governments like France. So the United States is not a major trading partner in Africa. In fact, if you look at the dominant trading partners in Africa, they would be the European Union, it would be China, and then India and the United States would be fourth on the list, and then fifth would be Brazil. And yet, during the Clinton administration, the United States legitimated its foray into Africa, that it was going to increase trade and development with Africa. If you look at what has happened in Africa since 2008, is that there's been a decrease in trade, because one of the main line of trade between the United States and Africa was oil. And Africa is no longer selling as much oil to the United States of America. But the important question for us in this era of COVID is the relationship between militarism and intellectual property rights. The question of intellectual property rights is important for Africa, especially in this period when we're talking about when Africa, South Africa, and India are talking to the World Trade Organization to waive the intellectual property rights so that vaccines can be made available to Africa. I'm showing a picture of General Kip Ward, who was the first head of the United States Africa Command. Now, General Kip Ward, as the military head of the US Africa Command, was using his own position in the military to advance the United States military interests in Africa. But regardless of how high the generals go in the United States military, they themselves face racism. And in a presentation I did, I drew comparison between the experience of General Kip Ward in the military when he was removed from his position because it was said that he took his wife on a military aircraft and stopped in Bermuda on the way to Africa, and he had to repay the military for the $80,000 that he spent on that trip. And we compare that to General Petraeus and his experience and how General Petraeus has moved on to private equity. And that's why Helen Cooper in the New York Times has been writing about the United States military as being a center for white supremacists, so that 41% of the United States military is non-white, and that is black and brown, that only 4% of the top generals of the United States military are non-white. And the writings of Ellen Cooper all of this year in the New York Times has pointed out to the growth of white supremacy in the military. For those of us in the peace movement, that's not our question. Our question is the role of the United States military, whether black or white, in perpetuating destruction. So after the United States justified militarism on fighting the war on terror, after the debacle in Libya, AFRICOM represented itself as a development agency. That is, the US Africa Command was promoting the 3 Ds: defense, development, and diplomacy. So the interagency operations meant that while academics were pointing to US bases and troops in Africa, the main thrust of the United States efforts was what was called interagency operations, where the United States, all agencies of the United States government, military, agriculture, health, education, reported to the United States military, so that the DoD language program, human terrain systems, Minerva Research Initiative were far more important in how they tried to influence African universities, African scholarship on the question of Africa. So the weaponization of everything meant that the weaponization of academia, weaponization of academic work, in line with the United States military operation in Africa. Now, the weaponization of the internet and cyber warfare is a new thrust of the United States. And I would urge those who are in academia to follow the attempt of full spectrum dominance and the control of internet waves in places in West Africa. So the United States military has failed in Africa. And we have now talked about failure. I won't go into great details. I've already referred to its failure in Iraq, Syria, Libya, but along with this failure has come the destruction of millions of lives. I want to repeat this point that I'm making. Because when writers such as Nick Turse write about the preponderance of US military bases in Africa, they miss out the more nefarious aspect of the role of the universities, think tanks, and graduate students all parts of the United States of America involved in the AFRICOM social science project in Africa. So what is the situation now? I'm going to wind down in this situation in AFRICOM, because the military itself write about the intervention in Libya as a watershed moment of the US Africa Command. And that watershed moment is a moment which should be discussed in all parts of the United States of America about how the United States created destruction in Libya and what this destruction in Libya has meant for the peoples of North Africa and the proliferation of weapons that came from Libya into West Africa. But the same white nationalism, the same racism, the same ideas of white supremacy that pervades the US military in the United States of America is manifest in people like Eric Prince, who, as a founder of Blackwater, has found a home in the United Arab Emirates, and the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia and Israel are allies with the white supremacists and Nazis in perpetuating US militarism in Africa at the present moment. Let me now conclude by talking about the question of racial capitalism, and that the struggle against AFRICOM is also part of the struggle against racial capitalism and white supremacy. There's been a lot of talk and writing about systemic racism in the United States of America. And in the talk about systemic racism in the United States of America, they've tried to downplay the question of slavery and the wealth that has been accumulated from Africa and plunder. But this entrenchment of systemic racism has meant that every institution in the United States of America is pervaded with white racism. And none other is where this is more profound than in the United States military itself. So that even the president of the United States of America called Africa a shithouse continent. Ronald Reagan called Africans monkeys. Henry Kissinger said that whites were there to stay in Southern Africa. It is that history of racism reproduced in the knowledge system of the United States that affects young people from the African community when they go to Africa. I want to draw your attention to the killing of Sergeant David T. Johnson, who was killed in Niger. Niger is one of those spaces where the United States is collaborating with France for the control of West Africa. And his body was left to rot. He was a mechanic in the Special Forces Group in the United States of America, in the US Africa Command in Niger. And when he was being buried in Florida, Trump called the mother of Sergeant David T. Johnson and insulted the mother and said, well, he should know what he was signing up for. And the same thing goes for Staff Sergeant Logan Melga, who was strangled to death in Mali by white racists. And the white racist, after killing Melga, went to a conference where the Pentagon organized to give his wife a medal, and the people who killed Melga wanted to find out from the wife what Melga had told her about their corruption in Mali, where the United States was supposed to be fighting terrorism. So the experience of racism in the military is well known. And so what we need to see is that this $1 trillion that is being spent on militarism is part of the reproduction of racism generally. As Du Bois said at the time of World War I, What do nations care about the cost of military if by spending a few hundred millions in steel and gunpowder, they can gain 1,000 millions in diamonds? How can love of humanity appeal as a motive to nations whose love of luxury is built on inhuman exploitation of human beings and who, especially in recent years, have been brought to regard these human beings as inhuman? This is the challenge in the United States of America. The challenge that the United States system views Africans as less than human beings. Let me end on this point. Since Donald Trump changed the leadership of the Pentagon 2 weeks ago, Christopher Miller, who is the acting Secretary of Defense, undertook to negotiate the end of the US military in Somalia. I have recently written a very long article called War as a Business, Lessons from Somalia, where I pointed out where it was a business between Al-Shabaab, the leadership of Kenya, the leadership of Uganda. But the Pentagon itself was negotiating with Qatar to buy off some of the leaders who were in business in warfare in Somalia. That pointed to the peace movement, that what was always being said about the war against so-called Al-Shabaab was actually work that the United States military was complicit, along with the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, in perpetuating the destabilization of East Africa. So I want to draw your attention to this event to show that just as how we had in Europe, the Good Friday Agreement that ended the war in Ireland, that it is possible with concerted diplomatic and political pressure for the United States to completely withdraw from Africa and for the dismantling of the United States Africa Command. But it will require much more coherence on the part of the left and the progressive forces so they do not buy into the propaganda war that Africa is an hotbed of terrorism. I'm going to stop there because I'm going to say that the political leadership in the United States of America, from the Black Lives Matter movement, the intellectual leadership that arose out of the uprisings of this year has fundamentally changed the country. And this change has manifested itself in people coming out in this multiracial and multi-generational alliance to beat back the white racists and the police brutality. How to build on that is the task of the peace movement at the moment. And I'm happy that the National Lawyers Guild is embarking on a series of education projects to oppose United States militarism so that we can pressure Black representatives of Congress, church leaders, community groups, peace groups in the United States to end the United States support the United States Africa Command. I'm going to stop there, Kerry. I think I went back beyond my 40 minutes.
No, that's fine. Once again, you have given us so much to think about. Thank you for that excellent and informative presentation. I know that there are lots of questions. And I'll let other people ask questions first. So people can either put their question in the chat, or you can raise your hand and I will call on you. You can unmute yourself. Okay, so Lisa Frith, please unmute yourself.
First of all, I'd like to thank you very much for that report that you gave. That was very comprehensive. Can anybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So I am speaking for myself, but I also want to share some information, okay? Because I support what we in the working class of all nationalities internationally, but especially in the US, the job that we have to do to unite the working class, which is multinational, multicultural, international, you know, with the struggle that's going on in Africa as well as all over the world. Because what the professor has expounded so very clearly in terms of the evidence that it is imperialism, which is headed by the US, okay, in conjunction with the other imperialist nations that are have created the conditions, all of what he described. The question is what to do about it, okay? And I want to say that what my experience and knowledge has taught me, okay, and this, I became aware of the WS.org site, which stands for the World Socialist Website. I think people should really check it out. It's from the Socialist Equality Party International, okay? And the fact is that the question is, how are we going to break, you know, the back of imperialism? How are we going to build a life that is beyond what we have now, okay, all over the world, which, you know, includes Africa, okay? As a matter of fact, because the fact is that we cannot, in what I've learned, we cannot solve these problems that has been expounded so eloquently by pressuring the present structure of government. We have to build, you know, the strength and the knowledge and the power of the working class. In, you know, those that are in Africa, that's what has to go on. Those in the US, that's what has to go on. We cannot be sucked into this thing of this one nation. This is how we're going to solve it. We're not going to solve it this way. We're only going to solve it by multinational internationalism, and also a program and a party that is multinational and international. And that's the Socialist Equality Party. And I'm just suggesting, I'm just putting it out there for people to read and to check it out for themselves, okay? Because all of what was said was absolutely true, okay? The question is, what do we do about it? Pressuring, like I said, the present structure is not going to get it, okay? They're bought and sold. You know, we saw them give away $6 trillion in America to Wall Street when the COVID hit, okay? Now they have not done anything, and they do the same thing everywhere, okay? And then we cannot solve the problem of racism unless we break the back of the system of capitalism internationally, in the US especially, because that's the heart of the most aggressive. We have to for it to be linked with the people of all nations. Okay, so I just wanted to put that out there because we cannot get sucked into this thing that it's just about one nation. The thing is that the suffering and the the hurt and the poverty and all of this is horrible, you know, all over the world, and especially in Africa, you know, where all of these things that has been described has gone on. But so that's all I wanted to say. So the WSWS.org site and the Socialist Equality Party, just check them out, okay? And thank you for letting me talk.
All right, thanks very much. The next question or comment is from—
I would like to say something to what Lisa said.
Sure.
I belong to a global movement for peace. And this global movement for peace is international, and it supports a new social system, and it supports what I said in the introduction: repair of the planet Earth and repair of human beings and fighting for our humanity. But Lisa, I think the proposals you made in relationship to the WSWS is something that the left has to be very critical of, because in the Socialist Equality Party, there is a minimization of the impact of white racism on United States society and international capitalism. One of the most important developments in the intellectual culture of the United States has been the leadership of people like Cedric Robinson and Robin Kelly and Barbara Ransby in clarifying the nature of racial capitalism. In other words, one cannot go forward in this country without dealing with the impact of systemic racism and the ideas of white supremacy and how this pervades sections of the left. And what has amazed me is the campaign that has been launched by the Socialist Equality Party against the 1619 Project. Here is a project which came out of the intellectual culture of Africans in the United States of America, explaining the role of capitalism in the super-exploitation of African people and the genocide of the First Nation peoples. And the 1619 Project, which is a basis for changing the educational system in this country, and the Socialist Equality Party has spent a lot of ink on what they call identity politics. I think that I would differ with those on the left that calls anti-racist struggle identity politics. It's actually people who are very comfortable in the skin of white supremacy to call the ideas of fighting white racism identity politics. So I would say, Lisa, that if we want to move forward in terms of an alliance of the working peoples, that we have to be able to educate all sections of the working people about the meaning of systemic racism.
Okay, and I respect what you've just said.
Lisa, I'm sorry, we have to move on.
Okay. I just want to say one thing about the 1619 Project. It was proved to be ahistorical, and they had to withdraw all of the premise for that. And that was why, because it created division within the working class over the question of racism, because the fact is that it was ahistorical. And that's all. And if people go to that site and read for themselves and get, find the information, then they can also discuss it in depth more. Okay. And that's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Okay. So moving on to the next person, Tunde, I know that you had a comment or question.
Yeah, thanks, Carrie. I just wanted to thank Dr. Campbell for that great presentation. It was super informative, and I thought it just brought in a lot of historical context and important pieces of information that some of which I wasn't aware of. So appreciate that. Thanks to you and you, Carrie, and the National Lawyers Guild for bringing this together. I also wanted to highlight that, as was mentioned in the presentation, the Black Alliance for Peace is, working on this AFRICOM issue. We're trying to bring a different perspective than the Pentagon narrative, essentially. And to that end, we have a campaign, US Out of Africa, Shut Down AFRICOM, which folks can check out on the blackallianceforpeace.com website. So I encourage folks to go there and check out the campaign demands. That's a big piece of this, and we're working to advance those demands and work with organizations on the continent. So I just wanted to call that out. But yeah, thanks again for putting this together.
Thank you, Tunde. Next is Marty Schmidt.
Oh, thank you very much, Carrie. And thank you very much, Dr. Campbell, for your wonderful talk. And I just had kind of a little question, but I'm really curious about your take on the ideological role of foundations and charitable organizations such as the Gates Foundation. I happen to live in the Seattle area, so preoccupied with how that works to, I think, promote militarism, but I'm interested in hearing what you think about that.
Thank you so much, Martha. The Gates Foundation has been complicit with the military in undermining African agency. It's in two areas that are very important in Africa, in health and education. The Gates Foundation is involved in something called AGRA, which is the Agricultural Revolution in Africa, which is to work with Monsanto and the biotech companies to change the ownership of seeds and the information about seeds in Africa. Mm-hmm. The Gates Foundation has also been very, very important in working with the United States World Bank philosophy in undermining the healthcare systems of Africa through PEPFAR. And so one of the things that Gates has done successfully is to isolate the discussion about the need for public health and healthcare in the United States of America. What I want to add, Martha, is at the end of apartheid, the foundations in the United States of America, that is people like the Soros Open Society Foundations, went on a project to promote what they call governance, democracy, and human rights in Africa. Mm-hmm. And governance for them was to persuade Africans that they should buy into neoliberalism and the World Bank prescriptions for Africa. So one of the things the left has not focused on enough is the work of these foundations in undermining African institutions and to tie up young Africans into this governance and democracy and human rights. Governance and democracy means supporting the IMF and World Bank, which means supporting militarism in Africa. So I wanted to thank you for that comment. And I think we need to be much more critical of the think tanks in the United States and the universities, because the think tanks, the universities, the Pentagon are all aligned in this information warfare against Africans.
Okay, thank you. The next question was in the chat from J. Pierre. I don't know if you want to speak, but he asked, can you speak more on Obama's role in expansion of AFRICOM?
Yes, Obama's role in expansion of AFRICOM. Okay, thank you. This is what I referred to in the recalibration of AFRICOM, where AFRICOM was moving from what Bush called the global war on terror to what Obama called the overseas contingency operations. And there was a continuity with the change of name. Now, Obama wanted to be very skillful by talking about the responsibilities of Africa. But Obama was never courageous enough to speak to the role of the Pentagon in Africa. And so at the time of the Libyan destruction, Susan Rice and Hillary Clinton and the representative to the United Nations who was in the White House at that time persuaded Obama to go along with the destruction of Libya. Now, in 2015, in an interview with Goldberg in the Atlantic, Obama said that this was the worst mistake of his presidency. And I think that nobody has asked Obama how it is that he came to make that mistake when it was clear from the email communication between Sarkozy and Hillary Clinton that this was a plot by France and in the United States, France and Britain, to take over Libya to ensure that Libya did not use its resources. Yes. So thank you, Michael. So Samantha Power was the third trio to persuade Obama. So what we need to do is to see how the holdover from the Obama administration who are now coming to the Biden administration carry the same humanitarian imperialism from the Obama period. The other point about Obama is in 2012, Obama went out to the West Point and to say that the war on terror must come to an end. And he thought that his own persuasion as a leader was enough to talk about the war on terror without laying bare the structures of the Pentagon that brought about this information warfare. And what Phyllis Bennis and Coburn has done in their book on ISIS was to show how the military infrastructure here responded to Obama with ISIS, and that the work on how ISIS came about in the Obama period is still has to be written. So the lack of the Obama's buying into private equity and retreating from any discussion of white racism was the logic of being the leader of the imperialist country in the world. So the Obama is as culpable as Bush in the destruction in Africa. Is that Obama tried to use the sophistication of being being pro-Black to cover up this. And we're going to get the same thing with people like Kamala Harris.
Okay, thank you. Jill Humphreys, I know you have a question. Jill? Okay, maybe she's gone.
Hi, Carrie.
Oh,
I'm sorry, I had to unmute. Sorry. Hello, Carrie. Hi, Professor Campbell. It's been a very long time.
Jill, are you back from Africa?
Yes, I am
Where
back
are you
from
now?
I'm in LA.
Oh, okay.
But I'm heading to Ethiopia. I'm heading back to Ethiopia over the holidays.
Back to Ethiopia.
Yes, and my question is related to your observation. You know, I've been following the conflict in Ethiopia, although I recognize it's regional. There's a regional context in which it's operating in. And I would like to understand a little bit more about why Prime Minister Abiy, I'm not going to use the term rebuffed, but I will say did not accept the African Union's attempt for mediation when the three African Union leaders went over, given what you said about how the US, right, undermines the AU, but here is an attempt by the AU to try to do an attempt at mediation. Could you talk a little bit more in detail or perhaps context as to why he would have done that and what that means in terms of the AU's efficacy.
Thank you very much, and good to see you again. I did an interview with KPFA in San Francisco and Berkeley last week on this war in the Ethiopia, and I want to state on this webinar that I support the African Union's position that there should be complete ceasefire and end to that war, and I support the efforts of the African Union. But I must say that the United States government and military has coddled the military leadership in Ethiopia. And by the military leadership, I mean both the current leaders in Addis Ababa and the leaders of the Tigray People's Liberation Front, the TPLF. In fact, when Meles was the president of Ethiopia, all of the main leaders in the United States, Susan Rice, Gail Smith, and all of the leadership in the United States coddled the Ethiopian leadership. And I think what I'm saying about demilitarization of the United States is also applicable to Ethiopia. One needs to see the complete demilitarization of Ethiopian society, because Ethiopian society has been held together by militarists, and the United States of America aligned itself with the militarists in the leadership of Ethiopia to create the situation that we have in Somalia and Al-Shabaab. And I don't know if you know the history of Jendai Fraser and Meles Zenawi in unleashing the terror and the problem that we have in Somalia today. So the problems of Oromia, problems of Tigray, the problems of the Somali in Ethiopia are all outstanding problems from the way in which Ethiopia is integrated in the global capitalist system. So the demilitarization of Ethiopia and the demilitarization of politics are aspects of the situation that the peace movement should be linked to in Ethiopia.
All right, thank you. Next, Larry Redmond, you can just ask the professor your question.
My question actually is, and maybe this harks back to what you were saying about Malcolm X. There's a militarization happening in the United States of America today that in my own view is designed to control people of African descent in this country. And my question to you is, do you think that militarization of the police to control Africans in America is linked to the AFRICOM foothold, trying to gain a foothold in Africa? I see these as like a pincer, and I'm wondering, do you share that view? Thank you.
Yes, I certainly share that view, and I want to see it. But I share that view, but I also want to see that the strength of the Black Lives Matter movement, the strength of the Black Liberation movement is something that we should not minimize. Because what has happened in the United States of America in seizing the political leadership in this country through the rebellion that went on this year is very important in changing the history of the United States of America. You see, the militarization of Africa and the militarization of the Black community they're both bound up with the National Defense Authorization Act. And you remember in 2001, it was only one Black representative, Barbara Lee, that voted against this. And that the billions of dollars equipment from the military that is passed on to the police force is something which the Black Liberation Forces have been talking about defunding the police, and that the militarization of the police is not good for this society. So one has to intensify the work which has come out of this rebellion, and to ensure that this new administration do not carry forward discussions about integration and diversity and inclusion. Because I spoke about in the presentation about the difference between General William Ward and General Petraeus. Among the Black military leadership at the present moment, there's a lot of disquiet because their promotion, their ability to get access to the Pentagon's largest is all rooted in the racism. Now, the point is that a lot of the Black middle class that are in the fraternities and sororities and in the boulets, for them, the problem of fighting racism is for Blacks to get more access to being in the leadership positions. And I think this is where I think the point that Lisa was making, that this should be an alliance of the working class against the capitalist class. This is the point that she was making, that we should not be buying into diversity so that we get more Black officers in the military, that we have more Black police chief, or we have more Black officers. Certainly on professional grounds, they need to be promoted, but we need to promote the fight in changing the structure of the society and come back to the whole question of reparative justice. A lot of people talk about Black Lives Matter, but they never interrogate points of the Black Lives Matter in relationship to questions like reparations and reparative justice. One of the things the Trump administration and the conservatives tried to do was to create division between Africans from the United States and Africans abroad. So in the reparations movement, they created something called ADOS, African Descendants of Slavery, so that there's a rift between those in the movement fighting for reparations, those who are from Africa and the Caribbean and the United States of America. So the left have to be mindful of the kind of work which is going on many fronts by the right wing to divide the people on the left fighting for peace and reconstruction.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, I think that's actually it for the questions and comments. Unless anyone wants to chime in at this moment, I think that we'll start to wrap up. We have already talked a little bit about what the peace movement can do, but I'd love to end the webinar with you sort of expanding on that, the different things that we can do in the peace movement to oppose and dismantle AFRICOM. Professor Campbell.
Thank you. And I really appreciated the discussion. I think that one of the things that we should not do is we should not buy into the information warfare, the propaganda against Africans, and the divisions that are being promoted between Africans in the United States of America and Africans of the continent of Africa. The Trump administration has gone down that road so that someone like Cornel West is now appearing on the platform of ADOS. So that we have to bear in mind that solidarity among the forces of peace, the solidarity among the force of social justice require that we place the anti-racist struggles at the center of our work.
I'm trying to answer.
In our discussions.
Well, I have some media on apparently.
Mary, can you please mute yourself?
Yes, in the work that has been done on reparative justice and the work around Durban, the question of reparations for enslavement and that slavery constitutes a crime against humanity. We have to be mindful that the Obama administration, Condoleezza Rice, Obama, Susan Rice, Colin Powell agreed with the Israeli government to ensure that the Durban platform does not come before the Human Rights Council of the United Nations. So the question of reparative justice and dealing with systemic racism means that people of African descent in the United States of America cannot be silent on oppression of other peoples, whether it's the Dalit peoples in India or the Palestinian peoples. And this is something that is very delicate in the politics of the United States of America. And so I would want to underline the fact that the Democratic Party in the United States of America have bought into the idea that Israel is the #1 democratic country in the West Asia, and that we should join with those citizens of Israel that oppose the oppression of the Palestinian people. I would also want to add that opposing United States Africa Command is also opposing APAC. Thank you, Kim. Opposing the United States Africa Command is also mean opposing United States sanctions against the people of Cuba and the people of Venezuela. Because in the case of Cuba and Venezuela, we can see how the conservatism of the racist forces from Cuba and Venezuela impacts the politics of the United States of America. So our work is cut out for us. And I would say that your work in the National Lawyers Guild is being accentuated because I know that in schools and universities, community colleges all over this country, there's room for you to change the curriculum of the law schools. This year, Princeton University took down the name of Woodrow Wilson from Princeton University because he was a racist. But Princeton University is not taking down the curriculum of racism, which is embedded in advanced education in this country. So all of the universities must now be open to the struggles of anti-racism in this country. So what I'm saying is that the struggles against AFRICOM is not a compartmentalized struggle of dealing with the United States military destruction. It's part of a broader struggle against imperialism and global capitalism.
Oh, excellent. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Well, everyone, thank you for attending this webinar. Many, many thanks to Professor Campbell. The webinar is being recorded and you'll be able to access it on the NLG International website or Facebook page. And, you know, just be in touch with us if you have any other questions or comments. All right, enjoy the rest of the day.
Thank you so much for doing this.
You're welcome.